Hello friends, welcome back to Haas of Props. I realized a few weeks ago that it has been forever since I made a Star Wars blaster. So then the question became, which one do I make next? I already made Han and Leia's, an E11 and a DC-15A plus many more, so I ended up landing on making a DLT-19X targeting blaster. We got to see a DLT-19 in A New Hope during the iconic "These are not the droids you're looking for" scene. Also, in Battlefront, the 19 is one of the many blaster options available, and from what I can gather, the X designation means it's a 19 with the sniper scope, and we get to see this version in the Bounty Hunters number 33 comic. With this build, if you leave off the scope, you can make a DLT-19, or if you add the scope, you can get a DLT-19X. So let's get started. So the blaster is quite a few pieces, but printing was fast and easy with my Elegoo Neptune 3. I wasn't too worried about super fine layers, so I set my layer height to 0.14 and my infill to 10% and proceeded to prep each piece while the next was printing. I don't want the print lines to be extremely visible, so I knocked them back with a 120 grit pad on my hand sander. Sanding on lines is pretty easy if you usually sand against the grain. Then I sand the pieces again with some 180 grit. Some of you probably already know this, but because the 120 is a smaller number than the 180, it means it is a more coarse sandpaper, which means it'll remove more material faster. By switching to higher numbers as we go along means we can refine the surface with smoother, finer grits and remove visible print lines. After the 180, I switched to some 400, and over the years I've tried different smoothing techniques, and sanding is the only one I have found to be the most successful. You can see now how the surface of the blaster butt is already a lot cleaner and has lost signs of its print layers. After all the pieces are sanded, assembly can happen. As a support, I'm using a 3-foot 5-inch piece of 1/2-inch wooden dowel. This will run through the entire blaster and the end can be trimmed off if need be. To assemble, I start with some E6000 and squeeze this onto the support. The E6000 is more shock resistant and will give a secure bond that won't crack easily. Then where the individual pieces will touch, I use some CA glue. The pieces can be slid on the dowel so they touch, and once I'm happy that everything is aligned and positioned correctly, I squeeze a few drops of zip kicker onto the seam. This will cure the CA glue in seconds, and the building can continue on. I simply repeat the same steps for the next piece of the blaster body. Next comes the first barrel piece, which snaps into the previous body piece. To hold this in place, I'm just using some CA glue because it is such a snug fit. You want to place the barrel piece so the flat area on these rings are positioned so they are on top. Then the next barrel connects into the first, making sure the indent is on the bottom. Then the next piece exactly the same way. And finally, the last barrel piece can be slipped onto the dowel and slid onto the previous piece. Alright, I forgot to record it, but there is a ring that slips near the seam between the last two pieces. Next, I printed the grip and trigger pieces in two to avoid warping, but the kit does include it both ways, split and whole, so you can print however you want. This attaches into the large slot on the bottom of the blaster, and since it's a secure fit, I'm just using CA glue. While I continue gluing and attaching, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize notifications so you'll always know when a new project releases. Thank you. Next, the magazine can be glued into the opening on the left side of the blaster. Then the side grip can be attached like so in its opening on the right side. Next, I assembled the blaster sights by beginning with attaching this piece into the blaster base on top and the little cutout made for it. Then the middle piece gets glued to the cutout on the barrel, which needs to be on the left side. And the last piece gets glued into the notch at the end of the barrel so the narrow pointed end points out toward the end of the blaster like so. Then the barrel's bars can be glued onto the outside of the pieces with the holes. The longer pieces go onto the longer barrel piece at the rear, and of course then that means the shorter ones go on the shorter barrel piece. In both cases, the bars rest in small indentations on the barrel. Next is the bipod. This is a non-functional piece, but it gets mounted to the bottom of the barrel in 3 places, and each connection point should line up with corresponding spots on the bottom of the barrel. In fact, the front peg slips into the ring I forgot to film earlier, so if you want to, you could wait until this step in order to make sure it aligns with the bipod. Now, if you want to add the X to the DLT-19's designation, you can add on the sniper scope like I am doing. First, I glue the crosshairs to the inside of the scope body. There are 4 small ledges for it to sit on. It can be a little awkward getting it positioned, which is why I attached it first before anything else would get in the way. Then this piece slips in here like this. Whoops, I had it backwards. I mean like this. Then the rear of the scope gets mounted in like so. Make sure that the 3 raised circles are positioned like here, or it'll create some funkiness later on. Next comes the small top clamp, which gets aligned with the piece below. Then the 3 knobs get attached in the 3 holes. They don't go in completely, they do stick up slightly. Then the front of the scope can be slid into place and glued. Now the scope gets mounted to the top here, where there are 2 small bumps. These bumps correspond to 2 dents in the bottom of the scope body. With that, the assembly is complete and we can begin the cleanup process needed before we paint. First, I want to fill all the seams between the individual pieces. To do that, I'm using my tried and true glazing and spot putty. I'm applying a generous amount with a palette knife because the putty does shrink a little and seams may open up again when it cures. After it's completely dry, I level it off by sanding it with the 400 grit sandpaper we were using earlier. Once the putty is flat and even, I'll base the entire blaster with some 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer. This will not only provide a nice primer base, but it'll also help fill any spots where print lines may still be visible, or spots that were a little difficult to sand and get to. Once the primer's dry, I'll even everything off again with the 400 grit. This will just help smooth out the surface and leave us with a nice clean finish. Once all sanded and the residue is wiped away, I base the blaster with a satin black spray paint. This gives a nice base to build on, and the satin provides a slight shine like the blasters in the movies, but not too much of one to make it look fake. Next, I mix some white acrylic with some black and a little bit of burnt umber to make a very light gray tan. To apply this in order to look like scratches and damage, I'm dipping the side of my palette knife into the paint and pull the knife across spots on the blaster to create chipping and distressing. Next, I repeat the same process with some charcoal gray. I'm applying this in a lot of the same spots as the light gray in order to tone down the brightness of the light and create more depth in the chipping effect like real paint chips have. Then to add some carbon scoring, I airbrush a mixture of burnt sienna and burnt umber around the opening of the barrel where the blast is released. Then to add a little more variation to the paint surface, I apply some flat black with a palette knife. This, when it dries, will create some spots of black where it looks like the surface is degrading and about to chip away. The last paint step was to pounce some metallic sterling silver around this ring right next to the blaster stock. I dab with a paper towel to help blend and even out the marks made by the brush. The final stage was to cut 2 lenses. Nothing fancy for this, I'm just using some plastic from a food storage container that I got from the dollar store. The small one gets glued into the small scope end, and the larger one in the other end. And with that, the DLT-19X is complete and ready for action. Making this blaster was a blast, because the model has so many variations and interchangeable parts, and I have to say, I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I think it's a great accompanying piece to the Clone Trooper DC-15A I made a couple years ago. It's huge. I mean, it measures like over 4 feet long. It's awesome and looks extremely badass. I hope you enjoyed this build as well. If you did, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and if you want to make one, I'll post a link to the files in the description. Please share with your friends, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.